When the business world abruptly shifted to remote work practices due to the pandemic, companies needed to change their operations. Suddenly, teams collaborated using online tools, and sales reps were forced to do virtual pitches. However, virtual sales meetings came with their own challenges like maintaining the interest of your prospect, the absence of sensory cues, technological issues, but perhaps more importantly, it also brought to the fore the issue of what happens when documents or presentations are sent and used offline. Our guest today believes that we need to close the gap to build out a complete point-to-point customer journey that can be tracked and has built a platform to do just that. Hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutworth.com. Everyday coaching. Our guest today is Itai Amoza. You're the co-founder and CEO of Storydoc. You're a seasoned entrepreneur. In the past 15 odd years, you've been involved in a variety of international tech startups, focusing on the areas of sales, marketing, strategy, and data. So I'm curious, Itai, was there a particular incident that drove your desire to build what is now Storydocs, complete that component, which we have traditionally taken for granted as being something that we can't control and is done offline?
Yeah, actually, yes. And first of all, super happy to be here. So thank you for having me in this great platform. And I think basically touching on what you just said, I think taking for granted was that, like, I had that moment when I realized that everything I do was taking for granted that part about sales materials, different types of collateral and decks. And once I went, like when I woke up from that kind of state of taken from granted, that's where I couldn't stop seeing it. I actually remember it very vividly that when actually on the previous company I was involved in, I was the VP revenue of that company. So I was very heavily involved in trying to get big enterprise customers engaged, interested, and eventually moving forward with buying what we were selling back in the day. And it involved, I'm talking pre-COVID days, so a lot of traveling, a lot of face-to-face meetings, a lot of boardroom presentations. And it was always quite okay in that meeting itself of being able to use your own force of personality to tell a story. But then it always ended up with send me your slides moment where, okay, awesome, send me your slides, we're going to show it to our boss, we're going to talk about it internally. And that's the moment where I'm basically letting go. And I need to do my best to book another flight a month from now, because without me being there, I'm never going to get the message across. And that was always something that bothered me a lot. And at one point, I remember actually coming back from one of those business trips, and on the way to the airport in the taxi, I was actually going through some sales presentations that another company that was trying to sell to us was sending me. And that's why I was looking at the phone. I didn't really had any very interested in what's inside. It was just like killing time, almost in a Twitter type mentality, or just doing something else. And that's when it hit me. That's when I realized that's the deck moment in any buying process. That's the moment that VP, budget holder, that doesn't have a lot of context and a lot of real interest in what's inside, is just like doing something else, opening their phone, cleaning up their emails. So nobody's really bothering to be fully concentrated in going through your 20 plus slide deck on their own. It's more of that phone, taxi, way to the airport moment. And that's where it hit me. And it took me a few good months of being in that moment until I fully realized what might be a solution. But to your original question, that was like a very strong kind of moment of realizing that this is why I feel so bad about my presentations, if that makes sense.
I can identify with it, and I'm sure listeners do too, that moment where you are faced with the reality that if your message hasn't quite struck home and is simple enough to retell, you have virtually no chance of getting other of your decision makers to come back onto the table and continue the conversation. So thank you for sharing that. You've obviously had quite a journey to date. So I'm curious, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
For me personally, that's a very tough question. But I would maybe spin it off to maybe my areas of passion, and just hope that they kind of align with things that I'm okay at. But I would say that it was always two areas that really took my attention the most. One was anything that has to do with storytelling. Like, how can you get someone excited about something, and like, can you get a message through? Like, it goes back to my first venture that was actually like a completely different way, but a different topic, but it was actually about how can you help backpackers. I'm talking about, almost 15 years ago, basically find a way in a mobile world. And it was an entire website that came in around the age that mobile started to be a really big thing when you're traveling. I wouldn't send anyone because it's in Hebrew, so it's going to be very hard for anyone that's not fluently to even make something out of it. But that's where the first time that I really came acquainted with the power of stories, and how once you do you can tell something in a very dry and technical fashion, but you can really make it an exciting and action-provoking, maybe that's the best way, experience for someone getting exposed to your content once you do think about them and how would they, instead of what do you have in your head that you want to put to paper, that's the dry version, if you like. But the story version would be how would someone that doesn't know that would want to hear about it? What spin do they need to tell themselves to get excited? So I think that was the biggest area of passion. And the second one would be around anything that has to do with data and analytics. I'm a very big data geek. Coming back to that same backpackers website, that's the other side of it. Like, one side would be, how can you make it exciting? And the other side of it is, how can you judge that this is really exciting? Like, how can you get to those content metrics and really learn what makes something highly valuable, other things that are less. So that I would kind of take these 2 points as the strong points.
And in those areas of strength, what would you say, or passion, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
So to be fair, I think that those two things are, like, at least today, both of them are very good buzzwords. I think everyone mentally today recognizes that they need to use data and do data-driven informed insights. And I think the same with storytelling, especially when you're speaking to marketers and also to salespeople as well. Like, it is a very known, again, but at the level of a buzzword. Like, I'm not sure that businesses always know how to put this to practice. I think it's very easy to understand why they are important and very hard and tedious to implement. It's an endless process, and it feeds itself as well. Like, you need to be a great storyteller, but then you need to be very good at learning from your data and improving your story and getting back to your data again, and they're not really disconnected. So I think what happens more often than not, that businesses don't understand that you always have to kind of have those two things in mind when you are working on. Like, in many cases, you have data analysts on one side and marketers that are responsible for storytelling on the other, and not always there.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you?
So, okay, you're back now. Your internet connection is showing as red or low.
Okay, so let me switch networks just in case. Like, I didn't get any update, but yeah, hope we can get that off the.
Yeah, I'll give that a light edit. No worries.
Okay, so I just switched to another network.
Okay.
I hope that
seems to be. Oh no, it's back again. It seems to be jumping around a bit, but hopefully it'll behave.
Okay. No, because usually if there's a problem, I get like some sort of notification, but I couldn't see.
Okay. Anything. Yeah, it's just showing on my end, but yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. So you were saying that the elements of storytelling and analytics and data are very powerful in itself. It's certainly buzzwords that are commonly used today, but to use it effectively in an organization is quite a different ask in itself. I'm curious, most people would say perhaps that they have a degree of proficiency in being able to tell a story. However, they may not have thought through this idea of using data and analytics to be able to track the efficacy of how well their story has landed and how well people are responding to the story and the call to action, perhaps at the end of the story. How were you in pre-COVID times using your storytelling abilities to ensure that people were following through on your calls to action?
Yeah, so I think that's a brilliant question. And the honest answer that I wasn't. I didn't have a very good way of doing that. It was very based on intuition. And look, when you do have a lot of these meetings face to face, you can read the room. And I would say that there's a lot of data points flowing your way as a human being in a room that allow you, at least in intuition, at least improve, get better, and really feel if the message has really landed properly. The first time I started feeling that I'm losing control, let's put it this way, of the situation was exactly moving to COVID and remote selling in particular, especially when you also realize that not only you went remote with your customers, but they went remote among themselves. And that really stayed since then, even coming back to offices. Still, most of the communication in many cases is being done over email or even Zoom meetings internally. And that's where you realize that you're absolutely blind into what's really going on beyond the conversation itself. And kind of when we put pen to paper and started imagining what Storydoc as a platform should look like, that was one key thing we were trying to uncover, kind of try and see what data points someone can pick up while pitching in front of people, that when this pitch is being consumed directly by your prospects on their mobile phone or on your laptop, how close can we get to that experience and still give you as much feedback as you can? Like, we're very obsessed about the fact that if you will go and pitch your product for 50 times in 50 meetings, the pitch would get better. But if 50 people would look at your sales deck after you send it after an initial conversation, currently most sellers wouldn't improve anything. Like, it would still be the same sales deck. And all those touch points would never really impact the materials and how do you actually use them to get your targets. And that's something that we really wanted to change, and felt COVID was actually the perfect opportunity in a way.
And there are a few aspects that I'd love to dive into, but I'm also aware that even today, people still use PowerPoint decks and PDF presentations or copies of presentations or proposals that they would send out. Obviously, these kind of go into the ether. We don't really know what happens to these documents. Would you say that people just believe that is the only option available to them, or is there a preference personally or otherwise for these kinds of traditional modes of presentation and proposals?
Yeah, no, I think honestly, people just are not aware they can do a lot better, to be honest. And I've been on this journey for a few good years now in trying to get people to open their eyes and see that technology these days have made it so simple to truly meet your customers with things that would actually get them engaged and interested, and seriously, effectively compete with all the other types of content that they're consuming outside of work. And this is what our brains are used to in terms of standards. If you think about like content made a massive leap from online content through things like Netflix and journalism, social media, like the level that you need to be at to actually be able to get someone's attention for more than 5 seconds, as the bar is really high these days. And I think just the PowerPoints of our world just didn't do a similar leap to get there. And I think it's more than anything, people are doing it. And if you talk to sellers, and we've done that a lot, most of them are saying, yeah, I know nobody's going to bother, but I have to send something, or they would expect me to send something. And I think that's the reason many kind of people in sales these days are still using these decks, not because they believe it's really helping them just as a sort of a must-have. But in fact, when you look at the data, that's that moment where your customer is going to open that deck and they're going to lend you their attention for somewhere around 5 to 10 seconds. That is the golden moment you have to actually send a message across and get that emotion and then action going. So when I see that every time that people were exposed that there is a better alternative, and they never look back. So that's why I feel quite comfortable to say, even in my kind of analyst's careful mind, that it's more a form of awareness than anything else, to be honest.
Right. And I can see that people should be able to cotton on to this idea of how powerful it is to be able to track an interactive presentation. Now, I think the word interactive is key, because in the past, when I have gone in to do sales or been asked to do a presentation, I think interactivity made the difference. My ability to ask questions, they respond, and so on and so forth, really made a difference there. What does that look like in the online space when you say interactive presentations?
That's actually something that took us too long to get to as a product, to be honest. When we started, we were looking at ways of how can you increase engagement, and went on to something that is, until this day, insanely effective, which is a lot of animations and blending videos and other forms of content that capture your attention. But only down the road really realize what you just said now, that in that kind of journey of getting as close as we can to what a person and a deck could be in a meeting with a customer, how can we get that meeting between your customer and the deck offline, like after the call, as close as possible? That's when we realized real interactivity is key for getting someone interested. And actually, when we've analyzed the way our brains work when we are absorbing a new story, we actually see that what would make it actionable and memorable would be to actually mimic the experience that you would have on a sales call. So if you think about a good sales call, it would, at the beginning, would have some sort of a strong, what we call hook, or something like a strong reason of why would you be interested. And I'm talking about the pitch aspect, like anything that kind of goes beyond the initial discovery would be to start and paint you a very strong picture of why do you want to listen to my story? What's going to be good in your life if you're going to listen to the rest of the details I'm just about to get into? You need to kind of put a big prize above their heads and capture their attention. That would be the hook part. Then, in most cases, there is some sort of an initial part that can be even just a few minutes, but that would be the salesperson pitching. So you paint a picture of the world, of the solution that you're proposing, how life is going to look like. And then, if they bought into it, they have questions, right? They have concerns, they have objections, they have details they want to dive deep into. And that's exactly where the third kind of act of this story or this experience really kicks in. And that's how we push the Storydoc users to do the same. Like start with a very promising hook at the beginning, then move on to an explanatory part where you more proactively explain to the prospect why they have a problem, why are you going to solve it, and how. And then move on to the last part where it's more about exploring. And then you get into more interactive aspects of jumping into different sections of the deck, browsing through different tabs within the same proposal, playing with an ROI calculator. All these ways are the way of where you can allow your customer to explore on their own. And basically, it's never going to replace a salesperson talking to you, but it's as close as a deck could be in getting there. And by the way, if you ask me, like the most effective interactive part would actually be blending in a next step. So if you think about it, like every sales conversation would never end up without a clear next step. Like the salesperson, as a professional, will try and frame the next steps, get some commitment and push for another meeting, for a legal review or anything else that can be done. We've seen that once you blend that into the deck, that is the perfect customer journey. So adding like the option, like basically turning the last slide from a generic thank you slide to, hey, click here to book us another call with your technical team and review so-and-so, or review our PO. And all these things, once you blend it naturally within the narrative, that is exactly where you can get back to controlling the sales process as you would have if you were in a meeting with this person.
Okay, if I'm hearing you correctly, you've got a brief hook, a little bit of an explanation, and then it's almost a little bit of a choose your adventure type thing, or multiple FAQ options that's available. Okay. Are you suggesting then, for those of us who might be going, oh, this sounds like an interesting idea, but how do I put this together? Would you suggest that we have a very clear purpose to the presentation, a very simple but clear purpose to the presentation, in order not to overwhelm the recipient with multiple options?
Yeah, so I think you're just right. And I think that moreover, like we have quite a lot of data proving that that overwhelming people with options is very risky. That's overdo it. And you basically lose the narrative. The customer is again in control of what they're exploring and experiencing. And you totally lost the ability to send them through a narrative that would end up in that booking that next meeting or approving that PO or signing the contract. And I think that the way of thinking of it for any kind of marketer or salesperson that is listening would just exactly what you would try and do in the conversation. That's how you should structure your deck. Like the same way you would structure your sales presentation, your sales conversation, sorry. And once you do that, then you would see that anyway, even if you get into a long series of questions, for example, in a meeting, right? A good salesperson should know to bring back the conversation to the mainstream and say, yes, we can always have a different chat about those technical parts, but the main thing I want to know is your timeline, for example. And that's my way as someone managing the sales call to bring you back to moving forward with my sales process. So it's the same way. Like I would recommend not giving too much freedom, but rather kind of allow it to be something that allows you to go slightly deeper in different aspects. But then, for example, send them to another deck if they need to, or just say, for anything beyond that, let's have another conversation. So when you think about the narrative, the main thing would be just like, imagine that you are there walking them through it. What would you do in these cases? And I think that in terms of putting this together, that's why I think, at least for me, I'm a big fan of templates. There is a lot of, before you actually hit the ground running and start getting data and insights, that's exactly where templates can be very handy because they are built on some best practices and proven data. So just like I'm a big fan of using email templates for outreach and meeting templates to try and structure a pitch for a new product, for example. In the same way, if I would have went on to build a new sales deck, I think starting from scratch would just be wasteful. It just means that you're going to lose on a lot of know-how that was already accumulated. And it's just going to be much easier to start from the recipe and then start adjusting it to your taste as you go.
So really, we should be thinking of multiple, I was going to say use cases, and that may well be, but you're almost treating this also multiple FAQs that need to be answered and separate decks for each of those. Would that be correct?
Yes, but I think in a way that will be adjusted to different customers. Like when you think about it if you think about it from the buyer's perspective, what happens when you leave the room, right? Your deck, your leave behind deck of any sort, if that's anything from a one-pager all the way down to a proposal, is basically you when you're not in the room. And if you think about yourself, like you wouldn't give the same answers to each and every stakeholder that would talk to you, right? So like you're leaving one deck behind, but different types of people are going to look at. Maybe your direct buyer would look at it, but their boss is going to look at it. And if you were talking to your boss, to their boss, you would have given a slightly different pitch. And if let's say the technical implementation team of the tech product you're selling would look at it or would go on a call with you, would give them a different pitch. But you only have one deck. And that's where I think, again, the interactivity is key in making sure that you do meet each and every one of these personas that needs to, you need to convince them, you need to get them mentally through the line in adopting you and your solution. They would have different concerns, different focus, and maybe even a different story or a different narrative of why they want what you have to offer. And you just cannot do that with a single one-off deck. So that's more than getting people overly confused, like with over different questions. What we've seen work best is basically when you go back to choose your adventure, is more of being able to give a quick overview of who you are, why this is relevant to the organization as a whole, what's the solution like, but then as fast as you can, try and get these different stakeholders into slightly different journeys. So, for example, having a section about security and technical implementation, that as the boss should only know that it exists, but they don't really care about the details. They would probably move on and maybe see the message about the ROI to the organization. That would just be a side of that. But if I'm the compliance person that needs to get this approved, then I might just have a sneak peek at the ROI bit, but I really want to dive deeper into a couple of slides about how these folks are with security compliance. So when you're building the choose your adventure, you really need to think about the internal process that your buyer is going to have to go through, and then try and make the deck, again, the best you out when you're not there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So this, one of the key issues, I guess, a lot of people run into is this idea of retellability, as I call it, which is the ability to share the message that you just shared with, hopefully, a champion within an organization, and get them to share that message consistently and effectively to others that you haven't met as yet. Obviously, having an interactive presentation makes this task a lot easier. However, there is the fact that we are dependent on the champion to actively use it. Do you have any suggestions or tips to ensure that we get their buy-in to actively using it and sharing it?
So first of all, you're absolutely right. Like at the end of the day, you do need to have at least one person to seriously sponsor this internally. Otherwise, it's really almost impossible to get anything done. Someone needs to put their neck on the line and eventually make it happen. But the bad news is that sadly, most people are really not good at it. Like most people are really not good champions. Like finding a champion that really knows how to buy something into the organization is a rare find. And every seller that gets one, you can immediately smell it in the first meeting. Eventually, they would jump right to the details. They would tell you what they need to get things approved. They would ask about pricing and so on very quickly. And that's a blessing. But from what I know, like it may be 1 out of 10 good opportunities might have that level of a champion that can really move things around. So I think for the average deal, you really need to know that it's just you down there. And then when your champion is more, even if they are highly motivated, at best, there would be a channel of getting you to the right people at the end of the day. So it's really about champion engagement, but also then enabling the champion to actually sell you effectively internally. Because think about it, like the champion a good one should be a good operator, but they have to be a great storyteller, just as a good salesperson would be to get each and every one of the different people that needs to be involved, excited and interested. And that's almost impossible to expect from someone that is not a sales professional. And I think too many sales teams are really relying on the champion to get convinced, and then going to get too many deals grown cold just because the champion is ineffective in getting the message across. And if we're boiling it down to what can make it different, then when you really analyze what are the challenges for champions to get things internally, one would be the ability to just engage the buying group, the group of stakeholders. There's always contradicting priorities. There's always different things on everyone else's table. And unless they are very senior or and maybe not even and very effective in moving things around, in most cases, they're not going to be able to control the organization's agenda very effectively. So anything that you can do as a buyer, as a seller to support them in making this important now would be key. And the second thing would be to tell the story. So basically talked about how having a deck that can be like automatically adjustable for different stakeholders would go a long way in getting people interested. So I think the biggest trick and tip that we've seen that is effective for the first part of like, how can you get this important, basically frame the agenda, is actually using personal notes on sales decks. So I think that would come out as a surprise to many, because most sales decks and proposals don't have a personal approach in them. Like you might personalize an email, but almost all the proposals and decks are a bit more formal. They talk about the company and us with you and how we can enable you as an organization, and there's no names in it. And we've seen time and time again that once you do blend in on the first slide, something that is a clear personal note with the salesperson image and name behind it, and basically speaking to the unseen audience into why are we doing this, that is the most effective way of making this go through, because then you basically go beyond what your champion can say, and you make sure that you deliver the narrative of why they're going to look into this deck, like why are we even here? And that's where you can speak about the pain points that you've discovered and then frame the entire solution in a completely different way. And if you come to think about it, it's no surprise that it works, because it's exactly like what the salesperson would do if they would meet these people in a meeting group. So it's the same line of thinking that leads to this solution. So yeah, totally. Like everyone that is not doing it right now, I would jump into your closest PowerPoint or Storydoc and immediately add like a couple of sentences on the first slide of just like, why are we here? Like, why are you just reading this at this very moment? And you'll see the results. It's just human psychology at the end of the day.
And with these personal notes on your platform, do those who are viewing the presentation have the ability to interact with that and enter their own notes, if I can put it that way, to ask questions and things without having to schedule a meeting necessarily?
Yeah, totally. So like at the end of the day, the whole point in Storydoc is eventually enabling your buyer to buy. What can you give them that will make it easy on them to get it through the line, get the answers they need, and then move forward? So it's all about making it comfortable for them to do that. Yeah, so one of the more popular features is the ability to ask questions or to leave like personal comments to the person you're forwarding it internally. Like we've seen the magic moment is when your champion gets your follow-up deck and they need to send it to their boss. And most people would just do something like, hey, I just met with these folks. They might be interesting for our whatever. Here's their deck. What do you think? So there's zero context, zero storytelling in this. But once you kind of let them, you can build a small form, for example, where they can answer a couple of questions, and suddenly there is context in this. You kind of enable them to explain why they're forwarding this to someone else. Another very popular option is to actually have add a live chat widget into your deck, which would sound simple, but that's exactly when sellers start getting questions real time. So instead of them discussing this internally and someone having a question, maybe writing it down in a different list that will eventually be sent out to you from the champion to answer before we move forward and so and so. Suddenly, as the seller is invited into the internal discussion, like suddenly you are in the room in a way, and you'll see that sometimes like legal teams would jump on the chat and would ask a few questions, and suddenly the salesperson can answer in real time and multi-thread the deal thanks to the deck instead of having to go through the champion for each and every interaction. So breaking the wall between you and the tier 2 decision makers that you didn't get to meet so far.
Very interesting. I also noticed that you could use your platform for things like case studies. I'm curious about that. Traditionally, it's always been a PDF and perhaps video at best. How would a case study on a platform like yours encourage interactivity?
Yeah, so I think more than anything else, case studies it's just insane almost to see in the data just how important they are, but only if they are the relevant case study. And I think that's where the secret lies, and everyone knows that, but it's not always easy to know which case study is going to hit home, which one is the most relatable one, which one is the most effective. And you'll see that in many cases, either sellers will be bombarded with 15 different slides that have case studies in them, or even worse, you'll have one slide with 3 case studies stacked in it, or an entire PDF just about one case study. But when you are about to send it out, let's say even as part of an outbound process and trying to get someone engaged, you're shooting in the dark. So you see that most SDRs, for example, would just have a couple of case studies they know or remember that are available, and that's the ones they're using mostly. We've seen that from the content perspective itself, it's just like another Storydoc in the sense that it's built out to have a very engaging hook at the beginning, lure you into exploring what's inside, then getting the story, in this case, the story of that customer that is featured on the case study, and then push you towards the next step would be, in this case, mostly book a call. But the real value was not in only the delivery of the content, but actually in how can you help the customer, we go back to interactivity, how you help the customer find the best case study for their own. So there's like different ways where you can basically see one case study, but also be able to see logos of other companies that they have a case study slide, and then one click will send you to that one. And those layerings, the different way of like layering the message is very effective in getting different people to see different case studies at the end of the day.
Certainly. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I can imagine it's very powerful as well, especially in ABM type scenarios, along with a host of other features that such platforms would allow for. Lots to think about there. Itai, I'm just doing a quick time check. To wrap things up, are there perhaps an aspect or two to this whole idea of creating interactive presentations or proposals that you find doesn't get talked about very much or doesn't get much airtime? If so, what would they be?
Yeah, so I think that's a hard question because there's more than one. But I think that it's really about, there's no, like, people a lot of the time ask me like, why this is effective? How do you folks can make things that work? And I said, honestly, there's no magic in it. It's only about being able to put yourself in your buyer's shoes. Once you effectively do that, once you really embrace a mentality of someone that never seen this deck before, that's when you can really get something that would go get the message across. I think that, and it's regardless of the platform and the content, and it doesn't matter if that's one slide deck or a 50 slide deck. What I see more often than not is people, when they're building out their decks, they do it with too much expectation from the other side. in terms of how concentrated are they, how much context do they have. And we live and breathe our company. So when we build out our deck or our product, we forget we are like an all-knowing God in this story that we're telling. We know everything. We know what's important. When we talk about terms, we know them, we live and breathe them. But when someone is opening up something fresh, everything is new to them. The design new, they never seen maybe even this font before. All those screenshots from your system that you might be adding, they don't mean anything. They never saw it before. So it's more intimidating than anything else. Maybe some terms that are, or even data points that are insanely common for you living and breathing this space might not ring a bell to that person that just saw it. So there's a lot to it, but I think that's the main thing, like the mentality of how an outsider would experience this rather than me talking about myself. And we all like to talk about ourselves. That's the intuition. But if you do embrace that counterintuitive mindset, that's when you can really get something extremely effective. Even before making it interactive, it's really that mindset that would anyway lead you to the best solution down the road.
So, and just with Storydocs itself and how far you've come along with Storydocs, has this primarily been product-led growth that's fueled your journey to date?
Yeah, for us, yeah. I think that as any early stage company, we actually did heavily on like sales-led MVP version, I would say. Because before you jump in and build a very refined funnel and product experience, you have to first of all feel the market and see what would make things interesting. So we actually started with the end. We actually started by selling it to customers and getting paying subscribers, purely sales-led without anything that is not handmade later. But once we've realized that this is something that people are happy to pay for and that is really delivering results, we always knew that it would have to be a product-led process. Not only because this is how we all believe products should be built, like you want to build trust and you want to let people get value first, even before you land in any salesperson. But mostly just and that's for any kind of go-to-market teams listening to this, I think that there is a lot of hype around PLG companies that sometimes not anything is perfect for product-led funnels. The reason that we went with product-led is because analyzing the customer journey led us to the fact that the entry point is anyway that moment where you need to personally build a sales deck, for example. And that was the reason we chose that. When we were looking at what we're replacing that product-led moment where you open up another product, let's call it PowerPoint or Google Slides or Keynote, and that's the moment where your presentation is being created. And if I would try to force my way in as a seller and sell it to an entire enterprise organization from the top down, it would be very unnatural. And it will be a headache to sell, and then a headache to activate, and then a headache for the customer success rep. And that's why we went with this strategy. Just because you always have to meet your buyer in that exact moment where they do really make a decision about their solution. And for us, it's a product-led decision. So that's why we had to be on the same level, if that makes sense.
And has there been a particular factor that has really fueled growth over the last year?
So I think there's two major things, maybe. For us, first of all, always virality was key because our product by design is built for helping you impress others and get others excited and intrigued. So for us, always inbound was a very important kind of aspect of building the business and building the pipeline. And I think what really accelerated this in our case was that we got more and more marketing teams adopting it beyond sales. And then it started trickling down to like more high exposure types of top of funnel materials that go beyond just the sales deck. So think about like e-books, white papers, reports, like maybe even in many cases like webinar decks, those things that are not one to a few, like a salesperson would use it, but also like one to many, like a marketer would. And that really, I think, fueled a lot of our growth in the passing year was just the fact that suddenly a lot more, like one user just basically gets a lot more eyeballs on how a top-notch kind of content could look like. That would be maybe the key thing. And I think the other one is just like everyone in our space feels that, which is the entrance of generative AI. Because first of all, there is a big wave of people just being excited. So a lot of people are suddenly in a mode where they are looking for alternatives to all tools that we're using. So if you're in the email space, I'm sure there's a boom there. But a lot of people suddenly realize you can get a lot more with technology than what you could have done a year ago. And that's where they're also challenging any kind of tedious task. And one of the things that people really hate is to start a new presentation. And we've just seen that people are looking for a lot more alternatives than before. So if you were kind of that weird alternative person like 2 years ago, suddenly everyone is looking for a PowerPoint alternative. And in that regard, we were lucky enough to be there with a very good alternative, at least hopefully.
Okay. Yeah. Your platform actually has an AI component to it.
Yeah, it's already in beta, and it's coming up in a matter of a few weeks. I don't know when this is going to go live, but hopefully most people that will listen to it already even will have the chance to use it. And I think honestly, like there is a lot of buzz around AI, but beyond the kind of the marketing hype, I think that at least for us, we've seen that the biggest kind of pain point for a new user would be exactly going that empty page, like that blank state experience. So even beyond the marketing hype, just from the pure value perspective for a first-time user, like AI, generative AI is just a wonderful solution that allows us to, instead of trying to make it something that would take you still a few hours to refine, into something that in a minute, you do get a good enough deck ready to go and fully adjusted to what you need. And you're just refining it rather than having to really start from scratch. So I do think that in that regard, that's the biggest value that we can offer by connecting to these tools.
Very interesting. And thank you for mentioning that, because I was going to ask you how most people deal with that blank page syndrome. To wrap things up, Itai, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
Oh, wow. That's something that you need to ask the listeners. That would be changes of my side to try and say. I think maybe boiling it down to what we said at the beginning, like instead of thinking about your deck as a must-have that you just send out, start realizing that people do open them, but then never read them. Like that you are losing momentum if you're missing out that opportunity, and just think about them as you when you're not in the room. And I think with that mindset, anything else comes along with it. Very simply, like once you recognize that, it's very hard to go back to not seeing it.
Yeah, sound advice. And if listeners are curious, wanted to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Sure. So first of all, go look for us on LinkedIn. You can look, I think, publishing quite a lot of high-end content and a lot of insights. And for all of you sales data geeks as myself, would find a lot of very interesting insights of what happens to your decks and your proposals when they are being evaluated internally. So anyone that wants to tap into that, I would look for Storydoc on LinkedIn. And other than that, just go and find us on storydoc.com. There's endless amounts of data-driven and data-proven templates for different types of collateral. So I think these are the two best places to get more of those kind of data-driven insights.
We'll include links to those in the show notes. Itai, this has been fabulous. Thank you for doing this.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.